The domestic disturbance call came in at 9:43 on a Friday evening. Neighbors reported shouting from a house on Riverside Drive, loud enough to be heard 3 properties away. The caller said it sounded like a family argument that was escalating, voices getting angrier, things being thrown or broken. Standard domestic call, the kind deputies handled multiple times each week. Arguments between spouses or family members that sometimes needed law enforcement presence to de-escalate before they turned violent. The deputy arrived at 9:58 and heard the shouting before he exited his vehicle. A male voice, aggressive and angry, yelling about betrayal and lies and consequences. A female voice trying to speak over him, words lost in the chaos. The sounds were coming from inside a 2-story colonial house, well-maintained property in a neighborhood of similar homes. The deputy approached the front door and knocked, identifying himself loudly enough to be heard over the argument inside. The shouting stopped immediately. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the male voice called out, telling the deputy to leave, saying this was a family matter and didn't concern law enforcement. The deputy explained that neighbors had called with concerns, that he needed to verify everyone was safe before he could leave. He asked the man to open the door so they could talk. The response was immediate and chilling. The man said if the deputy didn't leave, people were going to get hurt. The deputy backed away from the door and called for backup, explaining the situation and the implied threat. 2 more units responded within 8 minutes, and by the time they arrived, the situation had deteriorated further. The man had stopped responding to calls through the door, but deputies could hear movement inside, furniture being dragged, sounds that suggested the house was being prepared for something. One deputy spotted movement through a 2nd-floor window, someone appearing briefly before moving back into darkness. The sergeant on scene called for a supervisor and established a perimeter around the house. The 3 adjacent properties were evacuated, families told to leave quickly and take only essentials. Confused residents emerged with children in pajamas, asking what was happening, why they were being forced from their homes on a Friday night. The deputies couldn't provide details yet, only that there was a situation next door that required them to evacuate for safety. By 10:45, the crisis negotiation team had arrived and established contact with the man inside. He was coherent but agitated, making demands that escalated with each phone conversation. He said he had weapons, said his family was with him, said anyone who tried to enter would face consequences. The negotiators worked to keep him talking, to understand what had triggered the situation, to find leverage that might convince him to end the standoff peacefully. The investigation into the household revealed concerning information. The man was 42 years old, owned the property with his wife, had 3 children, ages 8, 10, and 14, living in the home. He had no criminal record, worked as an electrician, appeared normal in every way neighbors could describe. But dispatch records showed 3 previous domestic disturbance calls to the address over the past 2 years, each resolved without arrest, each described as verbal arguments that hadn't escalated to violence. At 11:30, the man made a statement that changed the entire response. He said he'd prepared for this day, that the house had been modified in ways law enforcement wouldn't expect, that trying to enter would be a mistake. The tactical team that had been staged nearby began reviewing building plans, looking for details about the property's layout. What they found was concerning. The house had been purchased 18 months earlier, and building permits showed extensive renovations during the first 6 months of ownership. The permits revealed modifications that seemed excessive for a residential property. Reinforced doors, security system installation, basement renovations that included what the permit described as a storm shelter. But the tactical commander recognized that the same features that protected against storms could be used to create a fortified position. The house had been deliberately prepared for a standoff, suggesting the man had been planning for this possibility long before the argument that had triggered tonight's crisis. At midnight, the situation escalated when the tactical team discovered additional information. The property adjacent to the house, a similar colonial owned by the man's brother, had been connected to the main house through an underground passage. The passage appeared on old survey maps but wasn't shown on recent building plans, suggesting it had been reopened during renovations without proper permits. The tunnel provided an escape route that law enforcement hadn't accounted for, a way for the man to move between properties without being seen. The brothers' house was evacuated immediately. The family told they needed to leave while investigators secured their property. Deputies entering the house found the tunnel entrance in the basement, a passage that had been concealed behind a false wall but was clearly accessible and recently used. The tunnel stretched 30 feet underground, connecting the two basements, providing a route that would allow the man to evacuate his family or escape himself without law enforcement knowing. The tactical team revised their plans to account for the tunnel and began examining the neighborhood more carefully. What they discovered was more elaborate than anyone had anticipated. The man hadn't just connected two houses. He'd created a network of escape routes through 3 adjacent properties. The survey revealed that easements and shared property lines had been used to create pathways that connected 4 houses, allowing movement between them without being visible from the street. By 1 in the morning, 15 families had been evacuated from properties surrounding the house. What had started as a domestic disturbance call became a complex tactical situation requiring coordination of multiple teams and resources. The man inside had fortified his position, established multiple escape routes, and claimed to have weapons and family members with him. Every decision about how to proceed carried risks that could result in violence. The daycare center that operated 80 meters from the house presented an additional concern. The facility cared for 45 children during weekday hours, with parents dropping off as early as 6 in the morning. The standoff was now past midnight, with no sign of resolution, meaning the daycare would open in less than 6 hours, with a barricaded suspect 80 meters away. The facility director was contacted and informed that the center would need to remain closed until the situation was resolved. At 2 in the morning, negotiators learned more about what had triggered the crisis. The man believed his wife was planning to leave him, had discovered she'd consulted with a divorce attorney, had found documents suggesting she intended to file for custody of their 3 children. His response had been to barricade the family inside their home, to prevent what he saw as betrayal and abandonment. The argument neighbors had heard was his wife trying to convince him to let them leave, his refusal to allow the situation to end any way except on his terms. The 3 children were confirmed to be inside the house with both parents. None of them had been allowed to communicate directly with negotiators, but the man mentioned them during phone conversations, describing them as his family that he was protecting from people who wanted to destroy their home. The negotiators heard the obsessive quality in his statements, the way he'd constructed a narrative where he was the defender rather than the aggressor, where holding his family captive was protection rather than abuse. The tactical team conducted surveillance using cameras and thermal imaging equipment. The technology revealed that all 5 family members were on the ground floor of the house, gathered in what appeared to be the living room. The man moved frequently while the others remained relatively stationary, suggesting they were being kept in one location while he patrolled. The weapons he'd claimed to have were confirmed through thermal imaging, showing the distinctive heat signatures of firearms. At 3:30 in the morning, one of the children was allowed to speak briefly with negotiators. The 10-year-old girl's voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of fear that was unmistakable. She said everyone was okay, that her father just wanted to keep the family together, that everything would be fine if people just left them alone. Her words were clearly coached, things she'd been told to say, but beneath them, the negotiators heard the plea of a child in a situation she couldn't control. The arrival of daybreak brought new urgency. At 6 in the morning, parents began appearing at the daycare center, confused by the locked gates and dark building. Police stationed at the perimeter redirected them, explaining that the facility was closed due to an emergency situation nearby. Most parents accepted the explanation and made alternative arrangements, but several demanded more information, wanting to know why their child care plans were being disrupted. Deputies couldn't provide details about an ongoing tactical situation, could only assure parents that the closure was necessary for safety. As morning progressed, the media arrived. News crews set up beyond the perimeter, broadcasting live from the neighborhood where a domestic disturbance had become a standoff. The man inside had access to television and saw the coverage, which agitated him further. He called the negotiators and complained about being portrayed as a criminal, insisted he was protecting his family, demanded that law enforcement leave so they could resolve their family issues privately. The negotiators tried to use his concern about public perception as leverage, suggesting that ending the standoff peacefully would allow him to tell his side of the story. At 8 in the morning, 6 hours before the standoff began, the man's extended family arrived at the command post. His parents, his brother, whose house had been evacuated, his wife's sister, and parents. They provided information about the family dynamics, about the man's increasing paranoia over recent months, about arguments they had witnessed or heard about secondhand. The wife's family described her growing fear, her careful planning to leave safely, her concerns about how he might react if she tried to take the children. Their worst fears had been realized when the argument had turned into a hostage situation. The negotiators arranged for the man's father to speak with him by phone at 9 o'clock. The conversation lasted 15 minutes, the father trying to convince his son to end the situation before anyone got hurt. The man responded with accusations, claiming his family had sided against him, that everyone wanted to see him fail, that he had no choice but to protect what was his. The call ended with the man hanging up abruptly. His agitation increased rather than calmed by speaking with his father. At 10 in the morning, 12 hours into the standoff, the tactical team finalized plans for forced entry if negotiation failed. The multiple escape routes complicated their approach, requiring simultaneous entry at 4 points to prevent the man from using the tunnel or other exits. The reinforced doors would require breaching equipment, the fortified nature of the house meant entry would be loud and chaotic, and the presence of 3 children meant every movement had to be precise to prevent casualties. The arsenal inside the house was confirmed through interviews with the man's brother. The renovations 18 months earlier had included installation of a gun safe in the basement, and the brother had helped move 12 firearms into the house when the man had purchased them legally over the course of a year. The weapons included handguns, rifles, and shotguns, all properly registered, all purchased without raising any red flags because the man had no criminal history and no documented mental health issues. At 11 o'clock, the man's wife was allowed to speak with negotiators. Her voice was steady but exhausted, the toll of 12 hours as a hostage evident in every word. She described her husband's paranoia, his belief that she was conspiring with her family and attorneys to destroy him, his refusal to accept that she simply wanted to leave an increasingly controlling marriage. She said the children were scared but unharmed, that her husband hadn't been violent despite his anger, that she believed he would eventually realize the situation was impossible and surrender. But she also provided information that concerned the tactical team. Her husband had been preparing for this possibility for months, had explicitly told her that if she tried to leave, he would make sure they stayed together one way or another. The fortifications, the escape routes, the weapons, all had been acquired and installed while their marriage deteriorated. He'd been planning for a scenario where law enforcement tried to separate his family, and everything about the house had been designed to make that difficult. At noon, 13 hours into the standoff, the negotiators shifted their approach. They stopped trying to convince the man to surrender and instead focused on getting him to release the children. 3 kids had now spent 13 hours in a tense, dangerous situation that no amount of therapy would fully heal. Getting them out became the priority, even if it meant allowing the standoff to continue with just the adults inside. The man refused. He said the children needed to see that their father was willing to fight for his family, that letting them go would signal weakness. The negotiators recognized the statement, revealed how the man viewed the situation. This wasn't about protecting his family. It was about demonstrating his control, about proving that his authority couldn't be challenged. The children were props in his narrative rather than individuals whose well-being should be the priority. At 1 in the afternoon, the man made his first demand that seemed negotiable. He wanted his wife to agree, on camera, that she wouldn't file for divorce, that the family would stay together, that the argument had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. The negotiators saw an opening, a way to potentially get the children released even if the concession was meaningless, given that any agreement made under duress would have no legal validity. But the wife refused to make the statement, understanding that doing so would validate her husband's narrative, would give him footage he could use to claim vindication. She told negotiators she'd rather remain a hostage than participate in his fantasy that their marriage could continue after he'd held the family captive for 13 hours. Her refusal enraged the man, who began pacing more aggressively, his movements visible through thermal imaging becoming erratic and unpredictable. At 2 in the afternoon, parents who'd been turned away from the daycare center that morning began gathering at the police perimeter, demanding information about when their children could return to care. The standoff had now disrupted 45 families' childcare arrangements, forcing parents to take time off work or scramble for alternative care. The inconvenience paled compared to what the 5 people inside the house were experiencing, but it represented the ripple effects of one person's decision to turn a domestic argument into a community crisis. At 3 o'clock, 14 hours into the standoff, the oldest child was allowed to use the bathroom. Deputies watching through thermal imaging saw the 14-year-old girl leave the living room under escort, enter the bathroom, and return several minutes later. The brief separation from the group provided an opportunity the tactical team noted, a pattern they might be able to exploit if forced entry became necessary. But any plan that relied on separating the children from their father carried enormous risks. The negotiators tried a new approach at the 4 in the afternoon. They brought the man's employer to the perimeter, someone he'd worked with for 15 years and trusted. The employer made the case that this situation would end one of 2 ways, either with the man surrendering peacefully or being arrested after forced entry. Either way, his life as he knew it was over. But if he released his family now, if he demonstrated that he understood the situation had gone too far, courts might show some mercy. If he forced law enforcement to storm the house, the consequences would be far worse. The conversation lasted 30 minutes, the longest continuous discussion the man had engaged in since the standoff began. He listened to his employer, asked questions about what would happen if he surrendered, expressed concern about going to prison and losing access to his children. The negotiators heard the shift in his voice, the move from defiance to uncertainty, the first indication that he might be considering an outcome other than fighting until forced entry became unavoidable. At 5 o'clock, 15 hours after the initial domestic call, the man agreed to release one child. The 8-year-old boy was the youngest, the one who'd been crying periodically throughout the day according to sounds picked up by surveillance equipment. The front door opened briefly and the boy emerged blinking into afternoon sunlight, moving quickly toward deputies who guided him to safety. Medical personnel checked him immediately while negotiators praised the man for making the right decision and encouraged him to release the other 2 children as well. But the man refused to release the others, saying the 2 girls would stay with him to ensure law enforcement kept their promises. The negotiators understood the statement revealed his continued desire for control, his inability to accept that the situation would end on terms other than his own. The release of one child was progress, but it also suggested that getting the others out might require force rather than negotiation. The 8-year-old boy was transported to the hospital for evaluation. Physical injuries were minimal, mostly exhaustion and dehydration from 15 hours in a high-stress environment. But the psychological impact was evident in his behavior, the way he flinched at sudden movements, the fear in his eyes when asked about what happened inside the house. He described 15 hours of his father pacing with guns visible, his mother trying to keep him and his sisters calm, the growing certainty that something terrible was going to happen. At 6:30 in the evening, the man's mother was brought to the perimeter to speak with him. The conversation was emotional, the mother pleading with her son to let his wife and daughters leave, to end the situation before law enforcement had no choice but to enter the house by force. The man responded with the same accusations and justifications he'd been using all day, but his voice carried less conviction, his words sounding rehearsed rather than genuine. The negotiators sensed he was exhausting himself, burning through the energy that had sustained his defiance. At 7:45, 18 hours into the standoff, the man agreed to release his wife. She emerged from the house moving slowly, clearly drained by hours of captivity, and the effort of keeping her daughters calm throughout. Deputies met her at the property line and escorted her to safety while negotiators maintained contact with the man, ensuring he didn't change his mind about letting her go. She was transported to the same hospital as her son, the 2 of them provided with separate rooms where they could begin processing what they'd endured. But the 2 girls remained inside with their father. The 10-year-old and 14-year-old had now spent 18 hours in a barricaded house with an increasingly unstable parent. The tactical team watched through thermal imaging as the man moved between rooms more frequently, his patterns becoming erratic. The girls stayed in one location, not moving unless directed. their body language suggesting resignation rather than fear. They'd spent 18 hours adapting to captivity, learning to read their father's moods, understanding that survival required compliance. At 9 in the evening, the man made contact with negotiators and said he was tired, that he'd been awake for more than 30 hours. He said he needed to sleep, but couldn't trust that law enforcement wouldn't enter the house while he was unconscious. The negotiators assured him they would wait, that no entry would be attempted as long as communication continued, that the standoff could last as long as necessary to reach a peaceful resolution. But they also knew that fatigue would make him more unpredictable. At 10:30, the man allowed the 14-year-old girl to speak with negotiators. Her conversation was different from the 10-year-old's earlier call. She was old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, old enough to recognize that her father's actions had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She told negotiators that her sister was exhausted and scared, that being inside the house felt increasingly unsafe, that she was worried about what might happen if their father decided law enforcement was going to enter anyway. The negotiators heard the plea beneath her careful words, the oldest child trying to protect her younger sister while navigating a situation. At 11:45, 22 hours into the standoff, the man's exhaustion became evident in his speech. He repeated himself frequently, lost track of conversations, responded to questions with answers that didn't match what he'd been asked. The negotiators recognized the signs of someone reaching their breaking point, when cognitive function deteriorated and impulse control weakened. The situation was entering its most dangerous phase, when poor decisions could escalate into tragedy. At midnight, approaching 23 hours since the initial domestic call, the tactical commander approved final preparations for forced entry. The decision would be made by the negotiators based on their assessment of the man's mental state, but tactical teams needed to be ready to execute within minutes if the situation deteriorated. Multiple entry points were established, breaching equipment positioned, teams briefed on roles and contingencies. The two girls inside represented innocent lives that depended on law enforcement getting everything right. At 1 in the morning on Saturday, the man contacted negotiators and said he couldn't stay awake any longer. He said he was going to sleep, that the girls would be in their bedrooms, that if anyone tried to enter, he'd wake up and defend his house. The negotiators tried to keep him talking, to prevent him from disconnecting and creating a situation where communication was lost. But he was beyond persuasion, simply stating his intentions and ending the call despite their attempts to continue the conversation. The tactical team waited 30 minutes to ensure the man had actually fallen asleep. Thermal imaging confirmed he was stationary in what appeared to be the master bedroom, while the two girls were in separate bedrooms on the second floor. At 1:45 in the morning, the commander gave the authorization to execute. 4 teams moved simultaneously, breaching entry points at the front door, back door, garage, and basement tunnel entrance. The entry was precise and coordinated. Officers flowed through the house and practiced movements, clearing rooms, establishing control, moving toward the bedrooms where the girls and their father were located. The first team reached the girls' rooms and secured them, carrying them out immediately while other teams continued securing the house. The man woke to find officers in his bedroom, weapons trained on him, commands being shouted. He didn't resist, perhaps too exhausted to fight, perhaps finally understanding that his fortifications and escape routes had been insufficient. He was taken into custody at 1:53 in the morning, 28 hours after the initial domestic disturbance call. The two girls were reunited with their mother and brother at the hospital, the family together, except for the father, whose actions had kept them captive for more than a day. Medical personnel evaluated the girls and found them physically unharmed, but psychologically traumatized, the impact of 28 hours as hostages evident in their behavior and responses. The house was cleared and processed as a crime scene. The 12 firearms were recovered and cataloged, the tunnel system documented, the fortifications photographed as evidence of premeditation. The man had spent 18 months preparing for this scenario, modifying his house to withstand a siege, creating escape routes, accumulating weapons. Everything suggested he'd been planning for the possibility that law enforcement would try to separate his family long before the argument that had finally triggered the standoff. The 15 evacuated families were allowed to return to their homes at 3 in the morning. Residents exhausted but relieved that the situation had ended without violence. They'd spent hours away from their homes, uncertain when they'd be able to return, aware that just meters away, a man was holding his family hostage. The neighborhood that had seemed safe and normal would carry the memory of this night for years. The daycare center opened on Monday morning, 2 days after the standoff, with enhanced security protocols. Parents dropping off their children were reassured that the situation had been resolved, that the man was in custody, that there was no ongoing threat. But the facility's proximity to the site of a 28-hour hostage situation made everyone uncomfortable. Several families withdrew their children, unable to feel safe bringing them to a facility where a man had held his family captive just 80 meters away. The district attorney filed charges that would ensure the man spent decades in prison. 3 counts of kidnapping for holding his wife and daughters hostage, 3 counts involving his son before he was released, weapons violations, and numerous other charges related to the standoff. The evidence was overwhelming, the 28-hour duration documented through communications with negotiators, thermal imaging, and testimony from 5 family members who'd been held captive. The trial revealed the extent of the man's preparation. He'd begun modifying the house within months of his wife first mentioning concerns about their marriage. The tunnel, the reinforced doors, the weapons, all had been acquired and installed while their relationship deteriorated. He'd explicitly told his brother that if his wife tried to leave, he'd make sure they stayed together, a threat that had seemed like frustrated venting at the time, but had proven to be a plan. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced the man to 40 years in prison, noting that he'd held his own children hostage for 28 hours, had prepared for months to do so, and had shown no remorse. The family attended the sentencing, the mother and 3 children present to hear the judge describe what their husband and father had done. None of them spoke to him. None acknowledged him when he looked their way. He'd destroyed their family through his own actions, and they'd made it clear they had no interest in maintaining any connection. The house where the standoff occurred was sold at a significant loss, the history making it difficult to find buyers. The tunnel was sealed, the reinforcements removed, the property returned to standard residential configuration. But the address would always be associated with the 28-hour standoff, the case that had required evacuating 15 families and closing a daycare center while a man held his family hostage using preparations he'd been making for 18 months. The 3 children entered therapy to process their experience. The 8-year-old boy, who'd been released after 15 hours, struggled with guilt over leaving his mother and sisters behind. The 10-year-old girl developed anxiety about being in enclosed spaces, the 28 hours in the house creating associations she couldn't overcome. The 14-year-old girl, who'd spent the longest time understanding the full gravity of the situation, faced depression and trust. Their mother worked to rebuild their lives away from the neighborhood where the standoff had occurred. They moved to a different city, started over in a place where nobody knew about the 28 hours they'd been held hostage by their father. The children changed schools, made new friends, learned to present a version of themselves that didn't include the trauma of that weekend. But the memories remained, surfacing in nightmares and triggering responses that 5 years after the standoff, the 3 children were managing their lives with varying degrees of success. The youngest had adapted best, his 15 hours of captivity brief enough that therapy and his family's support had allowed him to process and integrate the experience. The middle child continued struggling with anxiety, the 28 hours having created patterns that persisted despite years of treatment. The oldest had found ways to cope, but carried anger at her father that therapy couldn't resolve, rage at someone who was supposed to protect her. But the man remained in prison, serving his 40-year sentence. He'd attempted appeals arguing that his sentence was excessive given that no one had been physically harmed, but appellate courts consistently upheld the original sentence. Holding 3 children hostage for 28 hours, preparing for months to do so, refusing to release them even after his employer and parents pleaded with him, left little room for leniency. He would be 72 years old if he served his full sentence, an old man who'd spent his later life in The neighborhood where the standoff occurred eventually recovered its sense of normalcy, though residents who'd been evacuated never forgot completely. The house looked like every other property on the street, its dark history invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for it. But Longtime residents remembered the Friday evening when a domestic disturbance call had become a 28-hour hostage situation, when 15 families had been evacuated and a daycare center had been forced to close, when one man's inability to accept the end of his marriage had threatened an entire community. The lesson remained uncomfortable but necessary. Domestic situations could escalate rapidly, ordinary family arguments could transform into hostage situations, and people who seemed normal could be capable of holding their own children captive for more than a day. The standoff had required massive resources, disrupted dozens of families, and traumatized 3 children who'd done nothing except have a father who couldn't accept that his marriage was ending. The system had worked. All 5 hostages had been rescued safely, but the cost in trauma and community disruption was immeasurable. The deputy who'd responded to the initial domestic call received commendations for recognizing that the situation was more serious than a routine argument. His decision to back away when the man made threats, to call for immediate backup rather than trying to de-escalate alone, had prevented what might have been a more dangerous confrontation. The 28-hour standoff had been long and difficult, but it had ended with all hostages safe and the suspect in custody. The alternative, if the deputy had pushed for entry when first threatened, might have resulted in violence that couldn't be undone. 10 years after the standoff, the 3 children were adults. They maintained contact with each other and their mother, but rarely discussed what had happened that weekend. The experience had shaped who they'd become, had affected their relationships and choices, but it didn't define them completely. They'd survived 28 hours as hostages and had spent the following decade learning to live with what that experience had done to them. Their father remained in prison. An absence in their lives that was preferable to his presence would have been. The standoff existed now in case files and training materials, an example of how domestic situations could escalate into complex tactical scenarios. The 28 hours from initial call to rescue represented both successful negotiation in releasing 3 hostages voluntarily and necessary force in ultimately ending the standoff. The multiple escape routes, the fortified house, the months of preparation, all illustrated how some domestic situations involve planning and premeditation that complicated law enforcement response. The case became a teaching tool, helping other departments recognize warning signs and prepare for scenarios where domestic calls became barricaded suspect situations. The house where it happened stood ordinary among ordinary houses, its modifications removed, its history known only to those who remembered or researched. But the impact remained in the lives of 3 children who'd spent 28 hours wondering if they'd survive their own father's breakdown. In a community that had learned how domestic violence could threaten entire neighborhoods. In law enforcement protocols that were revised to account for lessons learned during those long hours of negotiation and tactical preparation. The standoff was over, but its effects continued in ways both visible and hidden, shaping how people understood domestic violence and how communities responded when family arguments became something far more dangerous.